Thomas Wilson pulled his woolen cap lower over his ears as he walked through the snow. At 68 years old, his bones felt the cold more deeply each winter. The streets of Millfield were quiet this evening, with most people staying indoors. To escape the bitter January chill, Thomas had spent the afternoon at the community youth centre, as he did 3 times every week. He enjoyed teaching the young boys and girls how to play basketball properly. Many of them called him Coach, even though he had retired from Millfield High School 5 years ago. Tonight, he had stayed later than usual, helping young Billy Thompson with his free throws. "Just need to get home and make some hot soup," Thomas muttered to himself, his breath forming little clouds in the freezing air. He leaned on his wooden walking stick, a gift from his students when he retired. His knee had never been the same after his time in the army, and the cold weather made it worse. The peaceful evening shattered when blue lights suddenly flashed behind him. Thomas turned slowly, confused. A police car had pulled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their faces serious in the glow of the streetlights. "Good evening, officers," Thomas said politely. He had always taught his students to be respectful to police. "Sir, we need you to stop right there," said the taller officer, his hand resting near his holster. The name on his uniform read, "Brown, is—" "Something wrong?" Thomas asked, his heart beating faster. In 40 years of living in this neighborhood, he had never been stopped by police while walking home. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Officer Brown said sharply. "Someone matching your description." Thomas blinked in surprise. "I'm just heading home from the youth center. I volunteer there." The second officer, whose nameplate read Fletcher, walked around Thomas, looking him up and down. "You seem unsteady. On your feet. Have you been drinking tonight, sir?" "No, of course not," Thomas replied, feeling a strange mix of confusion and embarrassment. "I have arthritis. That's why I use this walking stick." Officer Fletcher frowned. "I'm going to need you to put down that stick and show me you can stand properly." Bewildered, Thomas carefully placed his walking stick against a nearby fence. The wind cut through his coat, making him shiver. "Now I want you to do some push-ups," Officer Fletcher said. "Push-ups." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer, I'm 68 years old. I have arthritis. If you're sober, you should be able to do at least 5, Officer Brown added. "On the ground now." Thomas looked at the icy pavement, then at the stern faces of the officers. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself to the ground. His hands touched the freezing concrete, sending sharp pains through his fingers. 1, he counted, struggling to lower himself down and back up. His shoulders screamed in pain. 2, he gasped, arms trembling. Across the street, Emma Parker was walking home from her job at Millfield Primary School when she noticed what was happening. She stopped, shocked at the sight of an elderly man being forced to exercise in the freezing cold. She recognized Thomas immediately. He had coached her nephew last year. Emma pulled out her phone and began recording. Her hands shook with anger as she watched. 3, Thomas wheezed, his arms barely supporting him now. "Put more effort into it, old man," Officer Fletcher said coldly. 2 more. Prove you're not drunk." 4, Thomas said, tears forming in his eyes from the pain and humiliation. He had coached hundreds of children over the years, taught them respect and dignity, and now he was being treated like this in the same streets where everyone knew him. 5, he finally managed, collapsing onto the cold pavement. "You can get up now," Officer Brown said, seemingly satisfied. "Don't be wandering around after dark. People get nervous." Thomas slowly pulled himself up, his dignity in tatters. His pants were wet from the snow, his hands red and painful. The officers returned to their car without another word and drove away, leaving Thomas alone on the sidewalk. Emma rushed across. "Thou Street." "Coach Wilson, are you all right? I can't believe what they just did." Thomas couldn't look her in the eye. "I'm fine, Emma. Please, I just want to get home." "I recorded the whole thing," Emma said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This isn't right. People need to see this." Thomas just nodded, too ashamed to speak further. He collected his walking stick and continued his journey home, his steps even slower than before. By morning, Emma's video had spread across social media and throughout the town of Millfield. People who had known Thomas for decades, parents of children he had coached, former students, neighbors, all shared the video with comments of outrage and disbelief. Thomas sat alone in his small house, curtains drawn. His phone rang constantly, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. He had always carried himself with pride, had always been respected in this community. Now, all he felt was a deep, burning shame he hadn't experienced since returning from the war as a young man. He turned off the lights and sat in darkness, wondering how he would ever face his community again. Thomas Wilson's small brick house on Maple Street had never seen so many visitors. For 3 days, people came knocking. They left casseroles, pies, and handwritten notes on his porch when he didn't answer. His phone rang until the battery died. Thomas couldn't bring himself to charge it. He sat in his armchair by the window, curtains drawn against the world outside. The video of him doing push-ups on the icy sidewalk while police officers watched had spread everywhere. The local news had picked it up. People were angry, but Thomas felt only shame. "How can I face them now?" he whispered to the empty room. For 40 years he had walked tall in this town. Children would call out Coach Wilson when they saw him. Parents would shake his hand and thank him for the difference he made in their children's lives. Now all they would see was an old man forced to his knees. On the 4th day, someone used a key to open the front door. It was James, his grandson. The tall young man looked around the dark living room with concern. "Grandad, are you okay? I've been calling for days." Thomas didn't turn from his spot by the window. "Phone's dead." James walked over and gently placed a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "I brought some groceries, and I'm going to open these curtains. You need some light in here." Sunlight streamed into the room. Thomas blinked against its brightness. The whole town is talking about what happened, James said, pulling up a chair beside his grandfather. "People are furious. Mrs. Parker's video has over 50,000 views online." Thomas sighed heavily. "I wish she hadn't recorded it." "But Grandad, what those officers did was wrong. You're 68 years old. Making you do push-ups in freezing weather? It's harassment. It's abuse of power." James's voice rose with each word. "And it's clear what this was about." Thomas looked at his grandson's angry face. James was studying law at the university. He had his mother's eyes, Thomas's daughter who had passed away 5 years ago. The boy had his father's fire, though. "The police department released a statement yesterday," James continued. "Just a bunch of empty words about reviewing the incident. That's not good enough." James pulled out some papers from his bag. "I've been researching similar cases. We can file a formal complaint. We can go to the newspapers. My professor thinks we might even have grounds for a lawsuit." "No," Thomas said quietly. "No? Grandad, you can't let them get away with this. You're one of the most respected people in Millfield. You coached half the town. You served your country. And they treated you like—" "I said no," Thomas repeated more firmly this time. James fell silent, studying his grandfather's face. Outside, a car pulled up to the house, then another. Thomas could hear doors opening and closing, voices in his front yard. "That'll be the community meeting," James said. "They're gathering here to discuss how to respond to what happened. Mr. Harris from the church is leading it. They wanted to meet at your house to show support." Thomas stood up slowly, his joints still sore from the push-ups and the cold. He walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain slightly. At least 30 people stood in his front yard. Mr. Harris from the Baptist Church. Mrs. Thompson, whose son Thomas had helped get a basketball scholarship. Dr. Jenkins, who had been a troublemaker until Thomas took him under his wing 20 years ago. And many more faces, young and old, all people whose lives had touched his in some way. "Tell them to go home," Thomas said softly. "I need time to think." The next 2 days passed in quiet reflection. Thomas began answering his phone. He allowed a few visitors, old friends who didn't press him about what had happened. His neighbor, Mrs. Williams, brought fresh bread each morning. His fishing buddy, Bill, came by with coffee and sat in comfortable silence. On the 5th night after the incident, Thomas invited James over for dinner. They ate meatloaf that Mrs. Williams had brought, neither saying much until they finished. "The police chief called me today," James finally said. "They've put both officers on leave while they investigate. He wanted to know if we're planning legal action." Thomas nodded slowly. He had been expecting this. "The local paper wants to interview you. And that video keeps spreading. People are really angry, Grandad. They want those officers fired." Thomas rose from the table and walked to the window. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of grass underneath. Spring would come eventually, as it always did. "I don't want money," Thomas said quietly. "And I don't want those officers fired." James looked up in surprise. "What? After what they did to you?" "Firing them won't solve anything," Thomas replied. "Another department would hire them. Or worse, they'd stay unemployed and bitter. Nothing would change." "So what then?" James asked, confusion clear on his face. "You want to just forget it happened?" Thomas turned to his grandson, his mind finally clear after days of thinking. "No, I want something better." "Better? I don't understand." Thomas looked out the window at the town of Millfield, the place where he had spent his life teaching young people about respect, dignity, and second chances. The town that had embraced him, a black man when he arrived as a young veteran decades ago to teach physical education. "Something that might actually make a difference," Thomas said simply. "Something that might heal instead of punish. Something better than revenge." James stared at his grandfather, waiting for more explanation. But Thomas just smiled slightly, the first smile in days, as a plan began to form in his mind. The Millfield. Town Hall hadn't been this full since the Christmas pageant. People stood along the walls and sat on extra chairs brought in from the school. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned citizens. Everyone was talking at once, their voices creating a storm of sound under the high ceiling. "Batty." Exactly 7 o'clock, Mayor Phillips called for order, tapping his gavel 3 times. The room gradually fell silent. "We're here tonight to address the incident involving Mr. Thomas Wilson and 2 of our police officers," the mayor began. "As you all know, this incident has caused great concern in our community." Thomas sat in the front row, his walking stick between his knees. James sat beside him, papers spread on his lap, research for the speech he had prepared for his grandfather. But Thomas had written his own words. In the far corner, Police Chief Davis stood with his arms crossed. Behind him, looking uncomfortable, in their formal uniforms, were Officers Robert Brown and William Fletcher. They had come only because the chief had ordered them to attend. "Before we hear from anyone else," the mayor continued, "Mr. Wilson has asked to speak. Thomas, please come forward." The room went completely silent as Thomas slowly stood up. James moved to help him, but Thomas shook his head. He needed to do this on his own. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of his walking stick on the wooden floor seemed loud in the quiet room. Each step was deliberate. When he reached the podium, Thomas placed his prepared notes in front of him, then looked up at the sea of familiar faces. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his deep voice carrying easily across the room. "I see many friends here tonight, people I've known for decades, people whose children I've coached, people who have shown me nothing but kindness since I moved to Millfield 40 years ago." He paused, then turned slightly to look at the 2 officers in the corner. "And I see 2 men I met only last week, on a cold evening when they asked me to put down my walking stick and do push-ups on an icy sidewalk." A rumble of anger moved through the crowd. Someone called out, "Shame!" Another voice shouted, "They should be fired." Thomas held up his hand for quiet. "I've had a lot of time to think this past week, about what happened, about what should happen next." He looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. "I don't need these, I know what I want to say." He gripped the sides of the podium and leaned forward slightly. "I could stand here and talk about hurt," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I could talk about the pain in my shoulders that kept me awake for 3 nights. I could talk about the shame I felt when I couldn't look my neighbors in the eye. I could demand punishment for these officers. I could ask for money." The room was so quiet, you could hear the old heating system clicking. But what would that solve? Thomas asked. "Would it change anything, really? Would it make our community better? Would it make anyone safer? I don't think so." He turned fully now to face Officers Brown and Fletcher. Chief Davis had stepped slightly to the side, leaving the 2 men exposed to Thomas's gaze. "Instead, I want to build something. I want to start a program called Walking Together. I want these officers, yes, these 2 specifically, to walk with me through our community, not in uniform, not with badges, just as men learning to see each other as human beings." Officer Fletcher's eyes widened in surprise. Officer Brown stared at the floor, his face unreadable. Every Saturday for 6 months, Thomas continued. We walk, we talk, we visit the people they're sworn to protect, and they learn why an old man like me matters to this community. A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected. People exchanged confused glances. Mr. Wilson, Chief Davis spoke up, while I appreciate the unusual nature of your proposal, I'm not sure it's practical to assign officers to— I'm not asking for them to be assigned, Thomas interrupted gently. I'm inviting them to volunteer. On their own time, as men, not as officers. He turned back to face the crowd. I've spent my life teaching young people. Basketball, yes, but more important things too. Respect, teamwork, how to lose with grace and win with humility, how to see the best in others, even when they make mistakes. Thomas's eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of former students. Parents, neighbors. Many of you know that before I was a coach, I was a soldier. I saw terrible things in Vietnam. I came home angry. I came home hurting. And it was this community, all of you, who helped me heal, who gave me purpose, who trusted me with your children. His voice grew stronger. I believe in second chances. I believe in learning from mistakes. And I believe that walking side by side with someone is the best way to understand them. Thomas turned back to the two officers. So I'm asking you directly. Will you walk with me? Not because you're ordered to, not to avoid punishment, but because here it might make a difference. The silence that followed was heavy. Officer Fletcher looked at Officer Brown. Chief Davis looked uncomfortable. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Officer Brown raised his head. He was a large man with a red face and short-cropped hair. He cleared his throat. Yes, he said simply, his voice barely audible. Officer Fletcher hesitated, then nodded slightly. Not an enthusiastic yes, but a beginning. A collective exhale swept through the room. Mayor Phillips looked bewildered but relieved. Chief Davis's eyebrows were nearly at his hairline. Well, the mayor said, this is unexpected. One more thing, Thomas added. I want Emma Parker to document this journey. Take photos. Record some of our conversations. Show the community what's happening. Emma stood up from her seat near the back, her phone still in her hand, the same phone that had recorded the original incident. She nodded, tears in her eyes. This Saturday, Thomas said, looking directly at the officers, 9 in the morning, my house, dress warmly, we'll be walking for a while. With that, he stepped away from the podium and made his way back to his seat, the tap of his walking stick punctuating each step. James looked at his grandfather with a mixture of confusion and awe. In the corner, Officers Brown and Fletcher stood uncomfortably as people turned to stare at them. They had come expecting anger, demands, threats of lawsuits. Instead, they faced something much harder to defend against, an invitation to be better men. 9 o'clock Saturday morning arrived with fresh snow and grey skies. Thomas stood at his front window watching the street. He wore his warmest coat and a scarf his late wife had knitted years ago. His walking stick stood ready by the door. They won't come, James had said the night before on the phone. They only agreed because the whole town was watching. But at 5 minutes past 9, a blue car pulled up across the street. Officer Brown got out first, then Officer Fletcher from the passenger side. They stood awkwardly on the sidewalk looking at Thomas's house. Neither wore their uniform, but Thomas would have recognized them anywhere. He opened his front door before they could. Knock. Good morning, he said simply. Thank you for coming. The officers nodded stiffly. Brown was a big man with thick shoulders and a red face. Fletcher was thinner, younger, with nervous eyes. Ready to walk? Thomas asked, and so they began. Thomas, in the middle, the two officers flanking him like uncomfortable bodyguards. No one spoke. Their shoes crunched on the fresh snow. Their breath made clouds in the cold air. People noticed. Of course they did. Mrs. Williams, sweeping snow from her front steps, stopped to stare. The Miller children, building a snowman in their yard, fell silent as the strange trio passed. Old Mr. Jenkins, getting his newspaper, shook his head in disbelief. Why are they looking at us like that? Officer Fletcher finally asked, after they had walked 3 blocks in silence. Because they're surprised to see us together, Thomas answered. They expected me to hate you. Another block passed in uncomfortable silence. Why don't you? Officer Brown asked suddenly. Hate us, I mean. Thomas kept walking, his stick making little holes in the snow. Hate takes too much energy. I'm too old to waste what energy I have left. They turned onto Oak Street, where the houses were larger. The yard's wider. Why did you become police officers? Thomas finally asked. Neither man answered right away. They walked past the elementary school, closed for the weekend, its playground empty. My father was a cop, Officer Brown said at last, and his father before him. Never really considered doing anything else. Thomas nodded. And you? He asked Fletcher. Fletcher walked a few more steps before answering. My sister was attacked during a robbery at the store where she worked. The police caught the guy. I thought I could help people like that. And have you? Thomas asked. Helped people? Fletcher didn't answer. They completed their walk in silence, ending back at Thomas's house after an hour. Same time. Next Saturday? Thomas asked. The officers nodded, then left quickly in their blue car. The second Saturday went much the same way, and the third. People continued to stare. Children whispered behind their hands. But by the fourth Saturday, Thomas had a plan. We're going to visit some people today, he announced when the officers arrived. Their first stop was at a small white house with blue shutters. Mrs. Thompson, a widow in her 70s, answered the door. Thomas, come in, she said warmly. Then she noticed his companions and her smile faltered. Helen, these are my walking partners, Robert and William, Thomas said. I've told them you make the best tea cakes in Millfield. Mrs. Thompson looked uncertain, but she invited them in. Soon they were sitting in her cozy living room, while she served tea and small cakes on her best china. Thomas saved my Kevin, she told the officers as they ate. My husband had just lost his job. Kevin needed a football uniform, but we couldn't afford it. Thomas bought it himself, said Kevin had real talent, and he was right. Kevin got a full scholarship to college because of football. Now he's a teacher himself. The officers looked at Thomas with new eyes. He sipped his tea and said nothing. The next Saturday, they visited the Jenkins family. Dr. Peter Jenkins, now a respected surgeon, at Millfield Hospital, greeted them at the door of his large house. Coach Wilson, he said warmly. Then, seeing the officers, his expression grew cold. What's this about? Just visiting people during our Saturday walk, Thomas explained. I wanted Robert and William to meet you. Inside, over coffee, Dr. Jenkins told his story. I was heading nowhere fast in high school, fighting, skipping class. My parents were at their wits' end. Then Coach Wilson caught me smoking behind the gym one day. He smiled at the memory. Instead of sending me to the principal, he made me run laps. Said if I had enough breath to smoke, I had enough breath to run. Turned out I was pretty good at it. Track and field became my thing. Got me a scholarship. Got me to medical school eventually. You did all the work, Thomas said. You saw something in me when no one else did, Dr. Jenkins replied. As they walked back through town, Officer Fletcher spoke up. I never knew you did things like that for kids. Why would you know? Thomas asked simply. You never asked who. I was. You just saw an old black man walking at night. The following Saturdays brought more visits. They met teachers Thomas had worked with, former students who now had children of their own, neighbors who had known Thomas for decades. Each had a story about him, how he had waited at the bus stop with troubled teens to make sure they got to school, how he had started a summer basketball program to keep kids off the streets, how he had sat with a young mother at the hospital all night when her child was sick. By the third month, something had begun to change. The officers started, arriving with coffee for all three of them. They wore casual clothes without Thomas having to remind them. Sometimes they even smiled. My son asked about you yesterday, Officer Brown told Thomas one Saturday. He wanted to know who the old man I walk with every weekend is. I told him you were a coach, a good one. Thomas nodded. What did he say to that? He asked if you could teach him how to play basketball sometime. On the coldest Saturday in February, Thomas woke with his arthritis flaring badly. His hands could barely grip his walking stick. His knees refused to bend properly. Moving from his bed to the bathroom took 20 painful minutes. I'll have to call them, he thought. Tell them I can't walk today. But before he could reach, his doorbell rang. When he finally managed to open the door, he found both officers waiting on his porch. Between them was a wheelchair. We thought maybe we could push you today, said Officer Brown, his breath making clouds in the frigid air. "Fifth, that's all right." Thomas looked at them for a long moment. These were the same men who had made him do push-ups on icy pavement 3 months ago. The same men who had humiliated him, who had seen him only as a suspicious figure, not as a person, with a history, with dignity, with worth. Now they stood on his porch with a wheelchair, concern in their eyes. "Yes," Thomas said finally. "That would be all right." As they helped him into his coat and then into the wheelchair, Thomas realized that something had happened that no lawsuit, no firing, no public apology could have accomplished. Something had begun to heal. Not just in these two men, but in the community itself. They set off down the snowy street, Officer Fletcher pushing the wheelchair carefully while Officer Brown walked alongside, pointing out icy patches to avoid. And for the first time since they had begun their Saturday walks, all 3 men were smiling. Don't forget to use citations when referencing information from web search results. Spring came to Millfield, then summer, then fall and winter again. The Saturday walks never stopped. What had begun as an uncomfortable arrangement between 3 men became something much bigger. Other police officers asked to join, then local teachers, then business owners. Each Saturday the group grew larger. Thomas led them through different neighborhoods, introducing them to people they might never have met otherwise. Chief Davis watched with interest. At first he thought it was just good public relations after the bad publicity of the push-up incident. But then he noticed something changing in his department. Officer Brown began spending his lunch breaks shooting hoops with teenagers at the high school. Officer Fletcher started a reading program at the library where officers read stories to young children. Complaints against the police department dropped by half. "Whatever you're doing," Chief Davis told Thomas one day, "it's working." Thomas just smiled. "We're walking together," he said simply. "It's hard to fear someone you know." The mayor noticed too. When crime rates fell to their lowest point in 20 years, he called Thomas to his office. "We need to make this official," Mayor Phillips said. "The Walking Together program should be part of our police training. And we need a place where these walks can start and end, a community center." That was how the idea for the Wilson Bridge began. The town council approved funds to convert an old building near the high school into a community center. Local businesses donated materials. Volunteers offered their time. Even Officers Brown and Fletcher spent their days off painting walls and laying flooring. By the time of the annual spring festival, the center was ready to open. The whole town gathered in the park across from the new building. Colorful banners hung from trees. Children played games on the fresh grass. Food stands sold hot dogs and ice cream. On a small stage, Thomas sat beside Mayor Phillips. His grandson, James, stood proudly behind him. In the front row, Emma Parker held her camera, documenting everything as she had done for the past year. Officers Brown and Fletcher stood to the side of the stage in civilian clothes. They looked different now, more relaxed, more at ease in their own skin. Fletcher waved to a group of children who called his name. Brown chatted with Mrs. Thompson, who had brought her famous tea cakes for the festival. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Phillips began, standing at the microphone, "today we celebrate more than just the opening of a new building. We celebrate a transformation in our community." He gestured to Thomas. "1 year ago, a terrible incident threatened to divide our town. But thanks to the wisdom of one man, that moment of darkness became an opportunity for growth." The crowd applauded as Thomas slowly rose and made his way to the microphone. At 70, his steps were still careful, but he no longer needed his walking stick as often. "Thank you," Thomas said, his deep voice carrying across the park. "When I was made to do push-ups on that cold pavement 1 year ago, I had 2 choices. I could let bitterness grow, or I could plant something better." He paused, looking out at the faces he had known for decades. "I chose to plant something better. Not because I'm a saint, I'm not. I felt the anger, I felt the shame. But I remembered what my father taught me long ago. Revenge might feel sweet for a moment, but it changes nothing. It was his wisdom, not mine." Thomas gestured toward the new building across the street. "Today, I'm proud of what we've grown together. This center isn't just a building. It's a bridge between people who might otherwise never understand each other." Police officers will train here, yes, but alongside the community they serve. Young people will come here for mentoring, for sports, for help with homework. Neighbors will gather here to solve problems together. Mayor Phillips stepped forward with a large cloth-covered plaque. "It's my honor to officially name this center the Wilson Bridge," he announced, pulling away the cloth to reveal the bronze plaque. The crowd cheered and applauded. Thomas felt tears in his eyes, but he blinked them away. This wasn't a time for tears. Officer Fletcher stepped up to the microphone next. He looked nervous, running a hand through his hair before speaking. "A year ago, I was a different man," he began. "I saw my job as catching bad guys. I saw the world as divided into us and them. And then I met Mr. Wilson. Well, not met him exactly. I misjudged him. I disrespected him." Fletcher took a deep breath. "Mr. Wilson taught us that protection isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about respecting the people we serve." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm sorry for what we did, but thankful for what you taught us." Officer Brown joined him at the microphone. "My son plays basketball with Coach Wilson every Tuesday now," he said simply. "Last week he told me he wants to be like Coach when he grows up. Not a police officer like his dad and grandfather. A teacher. Someone who helps kids find their way." He smiled. "I told him that was a fine choice." Thomas rose from his chair. The two officers moved toward him, perhaps thinking he needed help. But instead, Thomas opened his arms wide. The three men embraced, right there on the stage in front of the entire town. Someone in the crowd began to clap. Then another person. Then everyone. The applause rolled across the park like thunder. When it finally quieted, Thomas returned to the microphone one last time. "This," he said, looking out at his community, "is the only revenge worth having, turning pain into progress." After the ceremony, people lined up to tour the new center. Children ran excitedly from room to room. Officer Brown showed off the new basketball court to his son. Officer Fletcher explained the reading program to a group of parents. James found his grandfather sitting quietly on a bench outside, watching it all. "You did it, Grandad," James said, sitting down beside him. "You changed everything." Thomas shook his head. "Not me. All of us together." Across the street, the bronze plaque gleamed in the spring sunshine. Below Thomas's name and the center's name was a simple motto: "Walk together." Emma Parker took one final photograph for her documentary. Thomas Wilson, surrounded by a group of police officers and citizens, all talking and laughing together like old friends. Old divisions were not completely healed. Such things take more than a year, but bridges were being built one step at a time. And that, Thomas thought as he looked around at his community, was worth more than any revenge could ever be.